Anton Cartwright, who works at the African Centre for Cities at the University of Cape Town and has been involved in a lot of work on climate change, both in the energy side and in the adaptation side, and particularly over the last few years working in cities. So Anton, very nice to have you here. And I wanted to actually talk about the work you've been doing in the city of Durban, where you've been working with the city to help it, I guess, come up with an adaptation strategy and prioritize different options. So perhaps you could just start off by explaining how you came to be working with the city of Durban and what they were actually asking you to do in the work you were doing with them.
Thank you. So the city of Durban, which falls under the local government jurisdiction of eThekwini municipality, I think has a long and internationally recognized status as an early adopter of climate change responses, and particularly climate change adaptation projects. They were one of the first cities to do a landfill gas to energy project and to register that project with the Clean Development Mechanism. And they've also been very active in the climate adaptation space, led by a couple of people who work for the municipality who saw the opportunity and wanted to profile the city, I think, as a progressive place to invest, to do business and to live. And what led to the specific piece of work that we're going to talk about today is Deborah Roberts felt the need to do an economic prioritization of her adaptation options. So the initial piece of work came up with 47 different options, which was it was a long list. But obviously within a budget-constrained environment, there was an imperative to say, well, where will our money have the biggest impact? And that was the work that we were involved in.
And how were those options decided? Because were they just sort of thought up from scratch, or was there work going on to see what other people had been doing in different vulnerability areas that mapped onto Durban's particular ones?
It actually started with a very big macro assessment, which identified vulnerable sectors, but in quite a top-down manner. That was a piece of work I wasn't involved in. And I picked up the work during an intensive consultative phase where we went around municipal officials and we actually asked them about what they were seeing, what they were experiencing, and also asked them about what in their pipeline of work, their existing pipeline of work, might be construed as a climate risk reducing intervention, or they didn't have the language at the time, but a climate change adaptation response. And so it was 18 months of consultation with a lot of time spent speaking to municipal officials. Again, the sort of underlying assumption was that we weren't trying to force anyone to work with us, but where we got a willing audience and uptake from municipal officials, we pushed in and we worked with them more.
Okay. So you ended up with this set of 40, whatever it was, options. So how did you go about then picking or coming up with a ranking or a selection process? What did that look like?
Well, the timing of this commission was very important, I think, because actually the global consultancy, McKinsey, had just produced a report called, it had a fancy name, but it was really the adaptation cost curve. Very similar to their mitigation cost curve, which was a very successful piece of work for them. And their adaptation cost curve, which they'd asked a number of us to comment on, and so we had early exposure to it, tried to do exactly what we've been asked to do, and say, well, where will we get biggest bang for buck for our adaptation spend? And actually, to our great benefit, McKinsey had fallen into a number of traps or pitfalls in trying to do that, particularly when trying to take that economics of climate change and apply it at the local level, which is a difficult thing to do well. And so we were fortunate in being able to learn from their mistakes, and we tried to design a system which piggybacked off their effort but improved on it. And I think we did. And I can be specific about how we try to do that, I think, if that's useful.
That'd be useful. So maybe just describe their cost curve approach, which is basically to say, this particular adaptation option would cost this much and produce this much benefit, and then you could rank them. That's basically what McKinsey did, right?
Exactly.
So how did you then do something different?
So what we thought was important in the context of the city of Durban, and actually most cities, but particularly Durban perhaps, was to recognize some underlying features of the urban fabric. And some of those features were the fact that actually we were uncertain about what climate change impacts would be. We had a rough, we have good climate models. We have a very clear sense of the trends on climate change, but it was very difficult to say climate change will cause this impact in this area affecting this number of people at this cost to society or to the municipality at this time. That level of precision we felt was unhelpful. In fact, there was a smorgasbord of potential impacts that we needed to acknowledge. That was the first thing. The second thing was that in the context of Durban, where you have quite high levels of inequality, people experience climate change risk very differently. Risk is always subjective, and I think environmental risk is particularly subjective. And for some people, climate change responses and spending money on climate change was actually almost inappropriate. It wasn't a top priority for them, particularly if they were unclear on how they were going to feed their families that evening, which is the lived reality of some people in the city of Durban. And so we needed to recognize the fact that not everyone had the same sense of climate change risk and the same sense of urgency around it. And related to that, we were very clear that we felt the most, and perhaps because of that, the best options were likely to be those that addressed people's lived reality and the multiple stresses that they experience on a day-to-day basis. So it wasn't just a case of removing climate change risk, it was a case of doing that in a way which addressed other imperatives for people around food security, around social safety, around personal health, and also crucial in the context of Durban, access to work, access to jobs in particular, and higher incomes, because that's part of the risk nexus in which climate change is a big force. Let's not make any bones about that, but we needed to understand the complex nature of climate risk in the city of Durban, and we try to do that. So instead of coming up with a discrete risk and a discrete intervention to reduce that risk, we try to take a much more systemic approach.
So what did that mean in terms of, was that, did you look at different options in the sense of the way they would cover these multiple different co-benefits, if you like, or did it happen earlier in the process, I guess?
The first thing to do was to go from 47 projects, which were projects and programs, but they were basically discrete. And we actually lumped them together into what we call 16 municipal adaptation clusters. And these were programs of action that we felt belonged together and which harnessed the synergies and the virtuous cycles of responding to climate change, which would address people's multiple exposures to risk at the same time.
So what happened after that then?
Well, the second big learning from the McKinsey report is that it's actually very difficult to, costs are easy to define for these programs. Most of them were on budget already. They had cost estimates, they had a capital expenditure and operating expenditure, and that was conventional economics that we felt quite confident about defining. What was much more difficult to define was the benefit that would arise if we actually pursued any of these climate responses. Now, traditionally, climate benefit in a cost-benefit analysis has been defined by the amount of GDP that would have been lost if you hadn't done anything versus the saved GDP that you experience because you've responded proactively. That's very difficult to do at the local scale. One, because we don't have good economic data. Two, because we were unclear as to just how much of the change in GDP we would be able to attribute to the response and how much would have been due to background factors or confounding influences. So we skirted around a benefit metric that included or had an exclusive focus on GDP. Instead, we went for a multi-criteria approach where we defined benefit as the number of people reached by an intervention, and then we weighted that number or subsets of that number by how we impacted positively on them when we reached them with the program. So if we saved their lives, we gave that number of people, that number of population, a weighting of 0.7. If we had a significantly positive effect, we gave the weighting of that population number a weighting of 0.5, I think, or 0.05 actually. And then, if all we did is hand over a brochure saying, be aware of flooding risk, we weighted that number of population that number of people with a weighting of 0.02.
Okay.
And so we ended up with this very people-centric approach.
So it was kind of number of people plus the magnitude of the impact per capita kind of thing.
And then in understanding the magnitude of the impact, we had a multi-criteria assessment which included things like access to employment, reduced climate change risk. And that was scored with the local officials so that we had a multi-criteria number, actually, which we then applied to we could use in applying the weighting to the reach of the program, and the reach was defined in terms of its demographic reach. And that was useful for us as well because the city of Durban, like a lot of local governments in South Africa, actually has quite good demographic data. So as soon as we understood the geographic reach of a program, we were able to quite accurately work out how many people we were likely to impact.
So you ended up with, in the end, kind of a number for any of these particular programs or options within the program. So did that actually then influence what was prioritized, or was it, because some people when they talk about this kind of multi-criteria analysis, they say it's actually the numbers in the end aren't what's important, it's the thinking and the discussion that goes along with trying to come up with these weightings. So how did this process actually then influence eventual prioritization and choices that were made?
Well, that attribution is always difficult, but what we did come up with is a metric for benefit and a metric for cost, and so we were able to do the cost-benefit analysis that we were asked to do, and in fact we were able to produce a climate adaptation curve which looked very similar in its appearance to the McKinsey effort, but had a very different underlying logic. And that was very clear in telling municipal officials, including the finance officials, where they would get the biggest bang for buck in spending their money.
In a multi-variable sense, because you're looking at multiple different benefits.
Exactly, but you did get a very clear ranking. What I should say is that we allowed the people doing the ranking, and as part of this process, to pick scenarios of future climate severity as a grounding assumption before conducting the analysis. And they could change their mind on that, but we gave them a 2x2, so 4 different scenarios which represented varying degrees of climate severity and actually also varying degrees of socio-institutional capacity, from proactive, all singing, all dancing local government administration to sort of failed state. And by locating the decision makers in one of those 4 quadrants at the beginning of the process, we were able to accommodate the subjectivity that I referred to earlier, and also tease out the implications of different grounding assumptions. And we were very clear that people were allowed to change quadrants at 5 minutes' notice and see the result of that, and that was useful. So yes, whilst in one sense it was an economic study and we were there to talk about how the municipality should spend its limited budget in the best possible way, I think it is true, not just fanciful, to say that the process itself was very important in getting municipal officials to think about things which weren't necessary in their core mandate and part of their day job, and getting to think slightly more systemically, and certainly bearing in mind that this was happening in 2012 and 2013, getting them to think more coherently around climate change and climate change response. And for me, one of the big benefits which came from that is that they were able to see climate change as a potential opportunity, not just a risk, not just an economic burden. And we were making the economic point very strongly, but get them to realize that actually by using climate change as a catalyst to do things which some of them wanted to do anyway, keep stormwater drains clear during the rainfall season, which is somebody's job, but to give them a climate rationale on that and to join the dots between their day job and the climate imperative, I like to think was quite useful. It's been interesting to track how investment has actually flowed in the wake of the study. We can talk about that if that's interesting.
Well, I was going to finish off by actually saying, so having done this, and what's different to what would have been happening?
Well, without going into the detail of the results, there was a very interesting, unexpected, interesting but clear kind of typology of results when it came to cost benefits. So actually the best bang for buck were what we call the socio-institutional responses. This was the not not the obvious stuff. This was the communication, the disaster preparedness, what some people like to call the sort of soft climate change adaptation responses. And actually, we found we could reach a lot of people at quite low cost, and those came out very favorably from the study. The second most favorable category, and this didn't please Deborah Roberts, because this is her portfolio, was the ecosystem-based adaptation. And most of the literature actually referred to that stuff being cheap and highly effective, but our finding was that it was middling, possibly because it involved acquisition of land, and we were talking about urban land, so this was expensive land. And that's perhaps why ecosystem-based adaptation in a urban context is not as cost efficient as some of the literature suggests. And then, of course, least cost effective was the big infrastructure projects, right? But we know across the world, and it's true in Durban as well, that there's often a bias towards those projects because they're tangible, they give people a sense of security, and also they're familiar. So one of the worst performing projects to come out of our study was the construction of a new dam to increase the levels of water security in spite of increasingly variable rainfall in the area, which is what the climate models are predicting. In fact, it was the worst performing option across all models, and that was Springgrove Dam, which was built very shortly after the study, which suggests that people weren't necessarily taking everything we did at face value. Actually, there was a lot of investment that had already been sunk into the dam, and they were committed to doing it.
It was hard to suddenly cancel the whole thing.
And then what is true to say is that the projects which came out, or the interventions which came out well from the study, which included the riparian zone setback lines, the sea level rise awareness and coastal setback lines, and a cross-departmental disaster risk reduction program, those projects have gained a lot of momentum in the wake of the study. Not necessarily because of the work we did, but because I think we're able to assist in mobilizing the people who are responsible for that work.
And so and the process helps to mobilize us, I guess, because they're involved in the process as well.
It's often what we say, but I think it's fair in this case to argue that the process is probably the most valuable thing to come out. And the collaborations, the sense of coherence, and the partnerships that were forged in the course of doing the work, and it was a 16-month study, I think have endured, and I think have been valuable to the city of Durban as they've pushed into the climate space.
So Anton, thanks very much. That gave us a really useful insight into what the process of making choices around adaptation options looks like in a real-world context. So we've really here had a really nice practical example of how one goes about assessing adaptation options.